What if I told you that the largest and most violent mutiny in Canadian military history has been deliberately erased from our history books? We all learn about Vimy Ridge, about Passchendaele, about the heroic sacrifices of the Canadian Expeditionary Force in the First World War. But what about what happened after the guns fell silent? Today, we're uncovering the story they tried to bury, the Kinmel Park Mutiny of 1919. Imagine this: the war is over. You survived the trenches, the gas attacks, the endless shelling. You were promised you'd be home for Christmas 1918. But now at March 1919, you're one of 17,000 Canadian soldiers stuck in a transit camp in North Wales called Kinmel Park. You haven't been paid in 4 months. Mail from your family takes half a year to arrive. Meanwhile, you see the prices in the camp canteen jacked up to 400% of what they are back home. On Christmas Day, while you ate cold bully beef, you saw your officers feasting in luxury hotels. The promises of a swift return home were broken. Week after week, the ships that were supposed to take you home were being used to ferry supplies, or, worse, civilian passengers who could pay. The sense of betrayal was suffocating. You fought for your country, and now it felt like your country had forgotten you. This wasn't a reward for victory. This was a punishment. On the afternoon of March 4, 1919, the breaking point was reached. Soldiers from Quebec and the prairies gathered, demanding to know when they were going home. They were met with dismissive answers and empty platitudes from their officers. The fragile discipline that had held the camp together finally shattered. That evening, the riot began. It wasn't just a protest, it was an explosion of rage. Soldiers broke into camp stores, seizing food, alcohol, and, crucially, rifles and ammunition. A red flag, the symbol of revolution sweeping across Europe, was hoisted over the camp. Some of the men declared the Kinmel Park Soviet. For nearly 48 hours, the mutineers were in complete control. They rampaged through the camp, smashing the barracks of unpopular officers, looting the overpriced canteens, and burning effigies of their superiors. They took over machine gun positions, turning the camp into an armed fortress. This wasn't a minor disturbance. This was a full-scale rebellion involving nearly every man in the camp. For 2 days, a piece of North Wales was a lawless zone controlled by angry, armed Canadian veterans. The authorities were terrified. The Red Scare was at its peak. With revolutions in Russia, Germany, and Hungary, the last thing the British and Canadian governments wanted was a Bolshevik-style uprising among their own troops. What if this spread to the other 80,000 Canadians still in Britain? What if British soldiers, also waiting to go home, got the same idea? At dawn on March 5th, the authorities decided to crush the mutiny with force. Loyal Canadian units, mostly from Ontario battalions, were brought in, alongside British reinforcements. They were armed with Lewis guns and fixed bayonets. What followed was a battle, not between enemies, but between countrymen, Canadians fighting Canadians. The assault was swift and brutal. In the chaos of hand-to-hand combat and gunfire, 5 Canadian soldiers were killed. 28 more were seriously wounded with bullet, bayonet, and bludgeon injuries. Let's remember the names of the 5 men who died. Corporal Joseph Young from Saskatchewan was shot while trying to pull down the red flag. Private William Teresevich from Manitoba was bayoneted in the fighting. Private Edward Smith from New Brunswick was shot by a British guard. Private Victor Clement from Quebec was killed in the crossfire. And Private David Gillen from Alberta was beaten and then shot during the looting of the sergeant's mess. These men survived the Great War only to be killed by their own side just months before they would have gone home. If you visit the beautiful St. Margaret's Churchyard in Bodelwyddan today, you'll find their graves. They have standard Commonwealth War graves headstones. The inscriptions are simple, stating their name, rank, and the date they died. Died the 5th of March, 1919. There is no mention of how they died. No mention of the mutiny. Their deaths were sanitized, their story erased. The cover-up began immediately. Canadian Prime Minister Robert Borden sent a secret cable on March 8th, ordering the absolute suppression of all details. Military censors in both Britain and Canada clamped down hard. Newspapers were only allowed to print a few vague lines about a disturbance due to delayed sailing. The 78 men arrested were tried in secret courts. 25 were convicted and sentenced to up to 10 years of hard labor, though most of these sentences were quietly dropped a couple of years later. The government's primary goal was to make the entire incident disappear. Returning soldiers were warned that if they spoke publicly about what happened at Kinmel Park, they could lose their war gratuity pay and their rights to farmland grants. For men desperate to restart their lives, this was a powerful threat of silence. The official history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, published in the 1930s and again in the 1950s, reduced this massive, violent event involving 17,000 men to just 2 sentences. An event involving more Canadian soldiers than the entire force at the famous Battle of Second Ypres was treated as a footnote. Why? Because the Kinmel Park Mutiny shatters our national myths. It complicates the clean, heroic narrative of Canada coming of age at Vimy Ridge. It shows that our celebrated soldiers weren't just stoic heroes. They were human beings who could be pushed to their limits, who could turn against their own command in a violent rebellion. It reveals a deep-seated anger and radicalization among many returning veterans, a distrust of authority that was politically inconvenient for the government, especially with events like the Winnipeg General Strike just around the corner. Ironically, the mutiny worked. In the 8 weeks that followed, the repatriation process was suddenly and dramatically accelerated. The government, terrified of another outbreak, finally found the ships. Almost all the remaining Canadian soldiers in Britain were sent home. The mutiny also indirectly led to better veterans' benefits and the creation of a department dedicated to helping soldiers transition back to civilian life. But the price was silence. To this day, the story remains largely unknown. In 1982, a tiny plaque was added at the Bodelwyddan cemetery, vaguely acknowledging a disturbance. At the 100th anniversary in 2019, there was no official Canadian government delegation, only a small private ceremony. Most shockingly, the Kinmel Park Mutiny is still completely absent from the history textbooks used in Canadian high schools today. We teach our children about the triumphs on the battlefield, but we hide the truth of the homecoming. We praise the soldiers for their sacrifice, but we conceal their anger and their rebellion against injustice. The story of the Kinmel Park Mutiny is a crucial, if uncomfortable, part of our history. It reminds us that patriotism isn't blind obedience, and that even heroes can be pushed to a breaking point by neglect and broken promises. It's a story of men who fought for freedom abroad, only to have to fight for their own dignity when they were supposed to be coming home. And it's a story that deserves to be told. Thanks for watching. If you found this story important, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more hidden histories. Let me know in the comments if you'd ever heard of the Kinmel Park Mutiny before. See you next time.